Thank you. This is a very important topic, obviously, but this is a very important day. This is the 76th anniversary of the freeing of Auschwitz. In 1971, I was in Cuernavaca with Heinz von Forster, and he gave me a book that he was working on. Heinz von Forster worked in the belly of the beast in the Nazis. He was an engineer. He was a Jew also, but anyway, he got by with that. And he worked on a book called The Dream That Was More Than a Dream, about the symbols and how the Nazis manipulated the symbols to get people to go along with what they were dealing with. What Stuart was talking about in terms of social media, that is to be expected. When you had a printing press, you had hundreds of years of war that then created the nation state. So just to be very clear, the nation state came out of the social media revolution of the printing press and ideas. We're going through the same thing now. The nation state was created in the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648 because 2/3 of the German population killed 1/3 of the German population because of their symbols and ideas. So whether it be in 1648 or in 1945, when they freed Auschwitz, we're still suffering from the same issues. So I want to talk about what Stuart pointed towards, which was what's the truth function of society? And I'm going to try to go around three concepts: how they use symbols, like with Heinz in his little booklet, how the founders use nature as a model of complexity, and the processes they used in design. So truth, symbols, nature, processes. That's the constellation I want to be working on. Totally changed my presentation because Jason asked me a question, two questions. The first one was, how many underlying assumptions held by the founding fathers are now out of date and need to be reflected on? For my 7 years of research on the Republic of Letters and all the diaries and journals, and this is how they would probably respond. Founding thinkers would reverse your question and ask, how many underlying assumptions held in 2021 are out of date and need to be reflected upon? 1700s systems and cybernetics were far in advance of your information artifacts, evidenced by the asymmetry between artificial intelligence on one hand and the natural human intelligence, the organization of our minds. We learn from natural systems complexity in the design of governing and government, not against it. Your science is powerful but anemic, malnourished, without natural philosophy and systems thinking from the Scottish Enlightenment. And there are many other ways I can deal with how they created their ideosphere. But your problem is the difference between how nature thinks and human thinks they think. So that's what I really want to respond to you, Jason, is yes. No, you guys are in problems. You're out of date. We were ahead of the times. As a matter of fact, we were ahead of the times in your way you think about cybernetics, because reflexive systems is integral to any symbolic management and organization of how you design government.
I fully agree with you, because I think we are losing common sense that the founding fathers relied on. And the common sense represents the whole tradition.
Who's that? Hi, Craig. Is this a convenient moment for me to give you an order?
What?
Thank you.
I think Bernard is talking on the telephone. The second question you asked, Jason, thank you. What kind of story systems and moral principles that they used then, and what has changed in the past 250 years? And I know story systems and memes, etc., are near and dear to you. And it was near and dear
Okay.
to the founders.
Okay. Little gem lettuce,
Bernard, you need to mute yourself.
cucumber,
Jason, can't you
Wait a
mute him?
second, I'll try to do that.
6
I just
tomatoes.
cannot do that quick enough.
Yes.
Okay, very
Okay.
good.
Okay. Story systems are mediums for interaction. Remember, medium and media are worlds of difference. Medium is an infrastructure, as you'll see, requiring systems thinking, which fully considers relationships unlike media channels. This gives you a more holistic advantage when you deal with the medium versus media. The purpose of a story system is to cohesively connect all aspects of the world you create through stories and the designs of the systems. A well-designed story system, because this is how, if you think about, what the QAnon and others and trying to form their identity, they're glomming onto a story system that is destructive, creates a vicious cycle versus a virtuous interaction. And that was the distinction the founders tried to look in systems. It wasn't about values. It was about processes that resulted in an Auschwitz or an immigrant coming here and building Tesla. The well-designed story system is like stepping back from a map so that one can see the actual territory. It's a truth function. And I'll use that thing, truth function. They didn't use that word back in their diaries, but they did talk about truth extensively because the American experiment went against the Western civilization core concepts. Just one example, linear causality, A causes B, versus systems causality, where cause and effect and functions are co-determining. So what you have to do is not understand your mind and your logic. You have to understand the interaction between your mind and the world, and that's logic out there. So it aids in survival. That's what a story system does, is aids in survival. Healthy story systems are always two-way interactive. And if you look at the design of the American experiment, and I use that intentionally, it was a revolution, yes, but they came from natural science and natural philosophy to design an experimental structure, hypothesis structure, etc., based on ideas that were far in advance of our cybernetics and systems, because it wasn't about information. It was about communication and interaction. And the important thing there is evolution never occurs with an individual. It only occurs at the species level. And so the unit of evolution is always species plus environment. It's the interaction, it's not the entities. And we will always think about the entities or the discrete parts. Okay, here's a media plan, like your media empires. I'm sort of making it in the voice of the founders, is like a map of cities with no roads. One way, it's a one-way control mechanism. The system is considered, a complete systems medium is considered is a consideration for the roads and types of transport people use while traversing. It's an infrastructure. I'm sitting here on my land here in Maryland. Literally the road from Washington to Frederick to the Cumberland Gap and the opening of the Ohio Valley literally went through my land. The C&O Canal is 1.25 miles from my house. That was done by Washington to create the infrastructure so that he didn't know what was going to go up and down there, but he allowed agency. And so think about how you design for agency. So how do you do your symbols, nature, processes to develop agency? The American experiment was designed as a story system of change, where the whole generates a greater intelligence by organization of processes, cross-cutting functions, and embodied truths. that last aspect was the major innovation of the founders. Embodied truths. Instead of the mind-body problem of Descartes, Newton, outside, an embodied truth, Americans are very practical, just do it type people. But during that time, they had to go to attack the philosophies of linear causality. They had to attack the philosophies of truth coming from what I call the double helix of king and church that controlled the people. A double helix of the power of the state and the power of the meaning structure, the truth structure of the church. And they came up with, by looking at nature, and this started, let me just give you a quick story. In the late 1600s, there's a guy called Dale. He wrote about and discovered the whole system of water transport in a tree. It was a system. The basis of the Scottish Enlightenment was in the dissecting rooms of the University of Edinburgh in the 1703s on understanding the regulatory principles of a human body. Before, it was hydraulics. It was, you know, if you have bad blood, I just bleed you and then it's better. They didn't understand the system. You know, just realize that by 1776, or actually 1758, with Abigail Adams, she was going out to the barn, scraping the cow pox from the udders of a cow, slitting open the forearms of her children and slapping in the cow pox because it was close enough to smallpox to get the antibodies in the system going. They didn't even know about germs then, hardly. But they understood and they could observe a system. So that whole systems approach, but it was an embodied truth. And the one thing that Jason, I would say in your two questions is the fact that what they did was forget about cognition and logic and all those wonderful things that came out of the Middle Ages, the analytic, where the subject and predicate are integral. They came up with not just the subject and predicate, but they came up with the idea of prepositions, of the people, by the people, for the people. So that aspect of getting out of subject object, which is discrete thinking. So just a quick story. I never really understood Gregory Bateson until I saw a video, and I've mentioned this once before on a Club of Remy, when Bateson says, I do not live in the world that you live in. I live in a radically different world. You live in a world of discrete objects, of things, and your mind is separate from those things. I live in a world of relationships, of interaction, of information and communication. When you're trying to change a system, which one do you change? And so that really provided for me that idea of when you read the founders' letters and this Republic of Letters that started basically in the 1730s or so and went to about 1805 or so. It was really this exploration, just like we're doing here today, trying to understand what's the problem. And when you chart usage of terms, you'll see the word systems starting in 1648, 1640s, or same time that you had the creation of the nation state. And so it went up. I mean, they're talking about systems and information back in the 1600s, much more than we're talking about it today. And then in 1708, the word problemique, which is sort of French, I can't pronounce it correctly, is change the idea of problem being a discrete object. I'm going to change Jason, I'm going to change you. 2, the interrelationship of problems, and that you must understand the relationship structure of those problems to solve it. And that's how the American thinkers really got going. So that was just a kind of long response to you, Jason, but I wanted to give you something in very important questions. So I'm going to go very quickly here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take parts of 2 of my presentations I put together for this. And so I'm just going to give some segments. So it was the cybernetic design of the American experiment that made it different than other things. So where is this origin coming from? It's the difference between a whole and a half revolution. Revolution 1, 1760 to 1781. Hey, I'm oppressed by these colonialists. You know, I got to get out from the under of the military militia being here and their terrible ideas. And it really started with the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act said every piece of paper, every newspaper, every book published has to be approved by a royal agent of the king. Americans learned how to tar and feather as no people had learned before. They went against these agents, and that started it. And what's interesting about the American Revolution is the revolution occurred in the common people long before Ben Franklin, Jefferson, and others. They were thought well, we can work with the British, But realize in signing the Declaration of Independence, 57 signers signed away their life, their property, and their sacred honor. And this is why, all during the time that there were 18, 20 or so ships coming with Prussian soldiers to suppress the American Revolution. Now, out of that 57, 9 were killed in battle, 5 captured, tortured, and hung. Merchants had their whole ship fleet swept from the seas. I have many stories, but what John Adams said is, I hope future generations understand the sacrifice we have made for your future. So they went from oppression, and that's a half revolution. Just get rid of the guys. And if you look at Africa, when I was growing up, each colony was popping up with their revolution, but the white faces were replaced with black faces that learned the colonial game of the second revolution, the revolution of mind that the colonialists gave there. So the second revolution that Americans had to create was from 1784 to 1791, when Jefferson was still as an ambassador over France, but they had this internet then, pigeons, Republic letters, that they had to go against a revolution of mind. And that's the symbolic structures. That's where nature comes in. That's where processes come in. They had to change their design criteria to be able to fit a failing colonial 13 colonies. After he won at Paris in 1781, 13 colonies were at one another's throat, and they were all going to go their separate ways. And the betting people in Europe literally were having bets on how soon the American system was going to collapse. I mean, that was the better than horse races at that day. So here's the issue. How do we fight? How do we think in the cybernetic systems and tools in the 1700s? And what they did was just like what Bateson talked about, is they lived in a different world than you and I. They sought the antidotes to power via natural philosophy, via communications. Lowe talks a lot about communications. They understood interactive systems. That came out of the natural philosophy, not the discrete fact science. So using information, communication. So how did I get into spending 7 years of my life reading these documents in the archives? Why did I I was at American Cybernetics Convention in Washington, and Mary Catherine Bateson, who unfortunately died about 3 weeks ago, we were sitting there between a session. I said, how can these ragtag American militia take on the most powerful system of the world? Military, economic, political. And she says, it's simple. It was the committees of correspondence. Committees of correspondence were created in the 1760s to fight the Stamp Act and the oppression of everything has to be approved by so-and-so, the king. And not only did they learn how to tar and feather, but they were created a network from Troy, New York to Syracuse to New York down to, Washington's estate of communication. So General Howe would say, who was the British commandant in the North area, the American they didn't use housewife, woman in the kitchen would know more about where my troops are than I do. We used intelligence to overcome power. And that was the theme in the design of government, of how to use information systems, communication systems, etc. So that was the sort of, and there was one thing that they really created, which was fascinating. Let's see if let's see if I can get this right. Find it here somewhere. What I'm looking for that is they created the 8th deadly sin. Now we all know the deadly sins, right? Lust, greed, etc. As a matter of fact, I have all the pictures of those things up in my study here. Those are the human frailties. Why were they so effective? They were so effective because it was a means of control by the double helix of king and church to control the people. Bob Kinsley, Nisley, you have greed in your heart. That requires, and then there was a major transition in the church in the year 1000. Instead of just giving dispensing and confessionals for sins, in the year 1000, the Catholic Church monetized sin. Bob, your sins cost 3 ducats. And if you know by when the period of Chartres and all these cathedrals, these amazing structures to the glory of God came from, it was built on sin and the monetization of the control mechanism of using the 7 deadly sins. Now, what's the 8th deadly sin? The 8th deadly sin was the sin of organizations. It reflected against the church. It reflected against the government. Instead of having truth coming from their voice, it was to understand how the organizations and framework and culture imprison us. That is just a torque of mind from being within a control system to getting outside and looking at that control system to be able to create a process that you can change the system. And what do we hear on the streets every day during the COVID thing and the Black Lives Matter, et cetera, is change the system, change the system. And it's going to be as ineffective as baby boomers like me going against the Vietnam War and saying change the system, because there's no tools to change the system. The military industrial complex is so much greater than it was in Laos, Vietnam, etc. So let me go to what was how did they think? And this is the core issue I like us to discuss today, is they used design tools. It was levels of analysis. So you're Mr. Titanic, you're going into an iceberg. You react to the events, etc. Stimulus response, gladiator pit. Trump is a master of getting you to respond. And once you respond, you're in the gladiator pit. Whether he wins or not doesn't matter. you have brought yourself to a stimulus response, symbol, symbol, trigger, trigger system. So what the American thinkers did, and I'm summarizing, they didn't say it like this, but they did it like this. First was systems pattern, and that's where Klaus and others have been talking about the need for a cybernetic critical systems theory. You know, it's just like the critical social change theory of the Marxists, et cetera, out of Germany, that then dealt with a lot of the communists, et cetera, in the US universities, that analysis. And you know, I was at the History of Consciousness program out at University of California. A lot of the types of history of Chicano, women's studies, Black studies, all came out of this group. I mean, we had Huey Newton, we had Angela Davis, we had everybody like that. And then you had some weirdos like me and Bateson and Stephen Nakmanovich that were saying history is not about just taking the unheard voices. Very important, but that's not. Americans looked at history differently. So what are the patterns through history? And this is a term crafted by Bob during his session that was recorded with Stuart Umpleby. And he gave me a phrase that I just love. The purpose of cybernetics is to predict the past. What? No, it's to predict the future. No, it's your structures that you're bringing along with you, your organizational things. I'm sitting here as a sinner, I'm under a control system, I don't recognize it. Unless I flip up, I don't see the things that are trailing me, entrailing. And that's what systems do, is a closed system that allows you to come up with the way I see and what's attentive and what's important in my field of vision. So then you're able to predict the future by understanding the past. And I'll get to an interesting slide on that one. Second one was, how do you sit there and understand the system's structures? And that was a really important thing of the design levels. And the last one is not intuitive. It's mental models. Hello, Jason. It's about your, ideas of images, etc. What in the American model dealt with mental models? It was a most profound model of intelligence based upon nature. This form of intelligence, truth function, whatever you want to call it, was about how do I frame and reframe the world I see by taking the core problem of politics, parts, wholes, parts, that interaction of individuals that are able to come together in a collective and develop a joint representation of the world, and then vote on things with people as representatives that then can hopefully provide a collective intelligence that aids in survival, truth functions with what is real. And what we're dealing with today is the unreality of a cognitive symbolic structure that's being manipulated. So, the fact that 45 senators last night voted not to impeach, that it was invalid to have an impeachment process. We have a big problem ahead of us. And so the mental models have been manipulated. Instead of a healthy system, which they were trying to frame, is getting all these parts to develop there. So what is missing today is the civilian citizen, the self-organization that de Tocqueville talked about in terms of how do I have the assembly of ideas. So in any dyadic two-level systems, you'll have pathologies. Triadic, you will have checks and balances. We don't have a triadic structure today. And if you look at everything that is in the design of the American government, it's all triadic. It's checks and balances. And what is it? Number one lesson of Engineering 101 classes is you need 3 points to find a center. And that center allows you to steer to navigate and what Hamish and others talk about in terms of interacting with the environment. So that was kind of a interesting way for us to talk about systems patterns, the critical analysis. How do you sit there and understand the system structures to then be able to design them? That's processing. And then how do you develop the mental models in the people that have a truth function? Whoa, that's an interesting task. How do they do that? I'm a cultural anthropologist. I kind of work in the area of cognitive archaeology. But that's what the founders did. They were able to get an inflection point. So on the left-hand side, you see the differential diagnosis, the critical structure. how to read history and how to read the present. We can't do that. We don't read history. We have let history to historians in Hollywood. It has to be read by the people. And how do they read it? So here's an example. There's a whole, I have sections in my book that deal with the infrastructure of ideas and supply chain that comes to this truth function that they dealt with. But here, there's three of them. Shakespeare. He introduced the question of power, finding the antidotes. He gave the portals into the king's chambers to see the hypocrisy versus the pomp and circumstance. Gibbons is really important. Rise and fall of the Roman Empire. Why? Because you have patterns in history that have consequence. That was the rise and fall that everyone read in that period of the intellectuals. And so it's the formation of patterns through time. So you better get those patterns of interaction right. So patterns and processes to be able to design, but you have to go back in history because you don't know what you're carrying with you. Oh, I'm in the sin structure, or am I in the 8th deadly sin, trying to understand why I'm in the structure. Then Adam Smith. If we talk about information, people talk about, well, he only mentioned the invisible hand a couple times. What's important about that is he used the word information all over the place. And it's how the infrastructure of information works in a marketplace is the circulation regulatory system of the wealth of nations. That's Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nations. It's a circulatory system. It's a heart that uses blood information to then circulate. So in the later sections, and I had arguments in 1971 when the Republicans tried to recruit me as an intellectual up in Croydon on the Hudson with the Hudson Institute. They didn't understand Adam Smith. They said, oh, it's just a pin factory inefficiency. No, it's about how you structure a system to be healthy and interchange. So those are sort of the differential diagnosis side. Now going to how they thought, a truth function. They were trying to rewire principles, learning, and context. So you had this ideosphere, the God of nature. This first line of the Declaration of Independence says, what do we base these things upon? The laws of nature and the God of nature. So I have whole presentations on that. That's important. Pursuit of happiness. It's not about me being jolly and having my mindful events today. Happiness was a community value that I cannot be happy unless my environment's happy. So the Americans separated the individual, the discrete thing, from an interaction of individual community. Pursuit of happiness. That's the freedom side. Equality. Equality was required because it's a good value, it's a good virtue. No. It's because you need the requisite variety in order to get the intelligence of the system. So we talk about the white people, these old white males that created this country as one homogeneous group. There were more diversity in this group than we have in America today. Yes, they were all white, but they came from different regions of England and Scotland, Ireland, that provided radically different cultural structures. So just real quickly, 4 voices formed America. You had the Adam Smith and the Northeast Puritans, law, the idea of right order. You had the hegemonic Southerners, which is my liberty, to hell with everyone else. For me and mine, liberty for me, and my slaves, I know what to do with them in the cotton fields. So, but what was unique about America is those hegemonic heads said, it's not just about me and mine, it's about us. They put their lives on the line, Madison, Jefferson, etc. So the hegemons were a critical factor there. Then you had the wild ass Irish Scots, the pioneers beyond the Appalachians there, and that's natural liberty. Oh, these are the NRI, and guess what? You want them on your military groups, and of course the South has always provided a lot of the military leaders, because it comes from that culture. And that was, from the 1600s to now, that cultural pattern still exists. Now what's missing today is that 4th voice in the mid-Atlantic. It was the Quaker voice, where their idea of reciprocal liberty. I cannot be all that I can be until you are all that you can be. Of course, that's Martin Luther King, but that's a summary of what the Quakers were trying to create. And a lot of Quakers were, like Dickinson and others, were very important on the creation of the Constitution. They didn't believe in the Revolutionary War, but they believed in the Reconstruction of America. The alchemy of political design. This goes to the heart of agency of the American experiment. It's the matter of, remember alchemy is, you take lead, you produce gold. They tried that for a long time. But it is a transformation of freedom into the liberty. It is the transformation of individual minds into the mind of the people. And what's interesting, they almost erased one of the most important distinctions used by the founders, which was they wrote then, the small mind, meaning my mind, and capital M, meaning the mind of the people. And they were looking at, and all these distinctions is, how do you get that interaction of transformation? There's 9 different transformations that I found that are in their literature that they wanted to accomplish the alchemy of political design, liberty, etc. Here's the feedback loop. What are the consequences of the processes that Gibbons and others of the other side said? So I didn't do this on this chart, but it's a feedback loop. And so what they were really looking at is truth and consequences of your collective intelligence. That goes back to Bob's idea, is we have to understand the past in order to predict the future, because we have to change the past or work with the past or carry the past because we carry the past. So that's sort of the quick overview image of what they were trying to do. Is we exist in the middle of the model. That's normal consciousness, common sense consciousness. We are trapped today, just like the sinners were trapped in the church business model of funding their indulgences. And what the Americans tried to do is go to the higher levels of the paradigm of the Western civilization and the more profound logic behind it. And that's what we need to be doing today, is we observe and measure within here, but our paradigms and logics how do we get up to those levels? I call this the snail chart. We bring all that along with us every day. How do we sit there, and if you want to have systems change, deal with that? Just one observation in relating to what Jason asked about was, we have an anemic, malnourished science, because the natural philosophy was a science of wholes. The whole circulatory system in a tree, the whole regulatory system of the human body and homeostasis that, we think that our 1950s cyberneticians invented. Well, it was already invented back then. So here's the thing is, systems change requires a cybernetic truth functions that goes up and down levels. It's a level problem. Reflexive folding back of the paradigm and its logic upon the model steers the visible command and control field of vision. Let me read that again. I think it's important. Reflexive folding back of the paradigm and its logic upon the model steers, and that's what we're talking about in government, is steering, rudders, governing, the visible command and control function. Ooh, okay. Just a couple more little slides here, and that'll. Here is an example of what I say is the truth, a approximation of what their truth function was. So you'll see here in one sense in that triangle, you'll see Karl Popper. I'm using various models here, but how it combines. And so designing reciprocal openings or narrowings of intelligence. That was the purpose of the design, to get corporate organizational agility and intelligence to be able to steer a nation and a state, right? And what I talk about is the pendulum of truth. So remember, Popper talks about world one, subjective, the symbolic world, the real states there. Now, the pendulum of truth is, if you start going towards the side with artificial models, symbolic narrative, your connection to the real world will diminish. There's an increasing gap. Whereas like the models by the founders and people from biological computer laboratories, looking at how the frog's eye communicates with the frog's brain and what it tells it, that was all on this other side of natural models, logic, laws of nature. Those artificial models and natural models are Robert Rosen. So you have the encoding and decoding between those. The pendulum of truth is, how do I stretch it back towards the living systems, the real states, zones of fitness, of survival, actual territory? One side is maps, other side is territory. How do I move that pendulum of truth this way? And then I took our Richard Knowles model of, on the right-hand side, you have the command and control. On the other side, you have living systems. But what's important, and this is what I think gives flesh to this sort of model, is the image, the symbolic image that Jason was asking about. How, and so that's the task, is how do I manage and organize? Cybernetics is about the organization of context, paradigms, logics, etc., outside my consciousness, of the system. It's the system, stupid, that we're talking about here. I can stop, I can talk just, I have a couple quick slides on what the contemporary world is doing and why we need a revolution. It's just 4 slides. You want to go through that, or do you want to start discussion? What's best, Jason? What do you recommend?
Go ahead.
Okay. Cybernetic thinking counters colonialism. This is the design of American experiment. Make America great again? No. Make America Great Britain again. We have become the British we fought against in our Revolutionary War. We need to be finding the antidotes to power and powerlessness in America of the 1700s today. It requires what Jefferson was concerned about, which was that second revolution of mind, which was about his statement is, I pledge on the altar of God eternal vigilance against tyranny over the minds of men. That's that image stuff. So, unless you understand colonialism, you will not understand today. I talked about breaking the double helix of secular power, kings, and religious power of truth and meaning. So you have the chessboard. This is Capitol Hill, the king, and the religion meaningful. So basically today it's QAnon and the king, Trump, having the capital then, and guess what? It's a carnage. Now, what was important out of the Treaty of Westphalia, it recognized the nation state. Now, that's a separation that's important as we design government. So you're designing government, the state, but you're also designing governing the nation. And so the traditional religion provided the nation the meaning. And what happened at the Treaty of Westphalia was, oh, well, okay, Spain, you become Catholic. Oh, you guys become Protestant there in the Netherlands, you know, whatever your configuration is. But it was separating the cultural side from the monopoly of the Catholic Church. And so you had these pockets. It worked great until communications, transportation took those differences up to the borders, and then you had the 20th century of wars, basically. That's simplistic, but the American Revolution created a new approach to truth and the union of people. Now, what is it about colonialism? Jesus. Why was an advanced form of cybernetics and systems necessary to counter colonialism? I'll read this. This is from 1835. This is from one of the great lords of the British Parliament that went to India. I have traveled across the length and breadth of India. I have not seen one person who is a beggar, who is a thief, and such wealth I have seen in this country, with such high moral values, people of such caliber, that I do not think we could ever conquer this country unless we break the very backbone of this nation, which is her spiritual and cultural heritage. And therefore I propose that we replace her old ancient educational system, her culture. For if the Indians think that all that is foreign and English is good and greater than their own, they will lose their self-esteem, their native culture, and they will become what we want them, a truly dominated nation. That's what we're dealing with today, when we have become the British we fought against in the Revolutionary War. Now take that and just look at how it spirals through history. Gregory Bates in 1944, Armistice Day, wrote to Wild Bill Donovan, who then headed up the CIA after the Office of Strategic Services was laid down. He says, out of British India and the Middle East will come a new form of warfare, where local natives use culture as a weapon against the white man. The Deobandi in the 1880s in the Deobandi area of India created two forms of cultural warfare. First one is still present today. If you look at the intellectual supply chain of ideas between Afghanistan and the Deobandi in India, it's still as flourishing as it was in the 1800s. And what was that? You do terror. You use the image of cutting throats, etc., killing children, to terrorize the symbolic system of your opponent who is more powerful. That was the bad seed. The good seed was Gandhi. He had the salt marches, he had the spinning wheels, he had all these things that was used against, that ultimately kicked out the British. Now that's sort of really interesting. So what do we have today? Truth and consequences, vicious or virtuous interactions. How do you undermine a democratic experiment? And this is from Neil deGrasse Tyson, a Black scientist. It seems to me if you can get the citizens of a democracy to no longer agree on what is objectively true in the world, then you have conquered them with all the strength of an invading army. And on the right-hand side, you see my superpower is to turn anything I don't understand into a conspiracy. No, we don't need to go through that. So that's how I want to sit there and present some ideas out to you. But just remember, you're looking at the diagnostic of the system's patterns, the system structures, and then what are the mental models that you need to be working on that allow a democratic experiment of the whole to allow the development of people and the creation of agency and intelligence by the interaction. So let me summarize what was the American experiment about. It was about the alchemy of information, communications, design that allowed the common to become uncommon, the ordinary to become extraordinary. It's a transformative governing structure of information infrastructures that allow one to draw out, because of the interaction structure of the conversation that you have created,